What if I told you that Max Verstappen's second place in the chaotic Las Vegas qualifying was not just the result of pure skill in the rain, but the consequence of a hidden discovery inside the Red Bull RB21 that Laurent Mekies did not reveal publicly until after the session? You saw Verstappen fight through rain, cold asphalt, and almost zero grip, but you did not see the specific weakness that the RB21 carried into the session. Mekies had already warned that the car only performs when it falls inside an extremely narrow operating window, a window that the cold Las Vegas night tried to slam shut from the very first lap. And after qualifying, when Red Bull reviewed the data, Mekies found exactly what he feared. The RB21 had spent most of the session on the edge of falling out of its performance range, leaving Verstappen to fight a car that could lose stability, grip, and balance with the smallest change in temperature or surface condition. Stay right here, because once you understand what Mekies discovered about the RB21, how the cold street surface nearly destroyed the car's limited operating window and how Verstappen still dragged it to the front row, you will see why this qualifying session was one of the most impressive of his entire season. The Las Vegas qualifying session unfolded under brutal conditions that immediately exposed the weaknesses of every car on the grid. The combination of rain, freezing asphalt, and the long straights of the desert circuit created a surface that refused to generate grip. Max Verstappen entered the session knowing that the Red Bull RB21 thrives only when it falls inside a narrow performance window. The moment he turned into the first sequence of corners, he felt how fragile that window would be in these conditions. The tires were cold, the front axle felt numb, and the slightest slide warned him that the car was operating close to the edge of its limits. As the session progressed, the rain intensified, and visibility collapsed under layers of spray. Verstappen relied on instinct as much as precision, driving through sections of the track where water pooled unpredictably and braking markers became vague silhouettes behind the haze. In these moments, he needed the RB21 to deliver clarity, but the cold asphalt punished every attempt to generate tire energy. Engineers on the Red Bull wall saw that the core tire temperatures were constantly falling, forcing Verstappen to fight for grip corner after corner. He was wrestling a car that resisted entering its ideal window, and every lap demanded perfect adaptation to keep it alive. The biggest challenge for Verstappen was the RB21's sensitivity. The file confirms that Mekies had already warned the car only works when all conditions align, and Las Vegas delivered the exact opposite environment. The wet surface destabilized the aero platform, the cold air reduced downforce efficiency, and the tires never offered a stable base for the chassis to lean on. Verstappen pushed into sectors where the car felt light, then moments later fought sudden slides as the rear axle lost traction. This instability forced him to extract performance from a machine that could fall out of balance with the smallest environmental change. Despite the difficulty, Verstappen refused to back off. Each run became a calculated gamble, measuring how much grip he had left, where the surface could support him, and how much risk he could take without letting the RB21 slip outside its narrow operational corridor. The telemetry later showed that he had to modify his driving style repeatedly within the same lap, adjusting braking pressure, steering input, and throttle modulation to keep the tires from dropping too far below temperature. It was a session where technique mattered, but adaptability mattered even more, and Verstappen showed both at their maximum level. The tension grew stronger as he prepared for his decisive push laps. The rain thickened, the lights reflected off the wet asphalt, and small errors from other cars disrupted the rhythm of the session. Verstappen remained calm, focused on feeling where the track still had some degree of grip. Red Bull engineers provided him with the minimal instructions necessary to avoid distracting him, knowing that too much guidance could break his concentration in such unstable conditions. The RB21 was at risk of falling out of its window, but Verstappen found a way to guide it through the narrow channels where it still produced performance. When the session ended, Verstappen had delivered a lap good enough for the second position, a result that surprised even those inside the Red Bull garage. What looked like another strong showing from the reigning champion was, in reality, a battle against a car that was constantly threatening to collapse beneath him. And when Mekies later revealed what the data showed about the RB21's fragility in the cold Las Vegas rain, it reframed the achievement entirely. Verstappen had not simply driven fast. He had held together a car that the conditions were trying to tear apart. The central problem Verstappen faced in Las Vegas qualifying began with the unique fragility of the Red Bull RB21. The car was designed around an operating window so narrow that even slight changes in temperature or surface grip could push it outside the range where its aerodynamic platform functioned correctly. On a night defined by rain, cold air, and an unpredictable street surface, that sensitivity became the defining challenge. As soon as Verstappen turned into the early corners, he felt the RB21 hesitating, unable to generate the tire temperature required to stabilize the chassis. The car felt light on entry and nervous on exit, a clear signal that the window was already at risk of slipping away. As conditions worsened, the RB21 demonstrated how demanding its aero concept truly was. The wet track reduced downforce efficiency, while the cold asphalt prevented the tires from reaching the core temperature necessary for consistent grip. Engineers observed that the car was oscillating between understeer and snap-oversteer as the surface changed beneath it. Verstappen could not rely on any single part of the lap to behave consistently, because every sector offered a different level of grip. The car was being pushed to the edge of its operational limits, and Verstappen was forced to manage that instability with exceptional precision. The problem was amplified by the RB21's dependence on predictable airflow. In dry conditions, the car generates substantial downforce through its floor, but in wet weather, that aerodynamic structure becomes more vulnerable. Water on the track disrupts airflow patterns, and standing water reduces effective load on the tires. For a car with such a narrow margin between peak performance and collapse, the rain made every corner a test of balance. Verstappen described moments where the car felt as if it was sliding across a thin layer of water rather than cutting through it, confirming that the platform was struggling to stay engaged. Another layer of difficulty emerged from the temperature behavior of the tires. Verstappen needed them to warm into a specific operating band to activate the RB21's aerodynamic potential. But the cold Las Vegas circuit drained heat faster than he could build it, leaving the tires oscillating well below their ideal window. Telemetry later showed that the temperatures dropped significantly on the long straights and never recovered fully by the time Verstappen reached the braking zones. With the tires unable to support the aerodynamic floor, the RB21 reacted inconsistently, and Verstappen was forced to correct the car constantly just to keep it stable. The rain also affected visibility in a way that worsened the underlying problem. Verstappen had to rely more heavily on feel than on visual cues as spray from the cars ahead obscured his reference points. In these moments, a driver needs a car that behaves predictably so he can trust his muscle memory and instinct. But the RB21 behaved differently every lap. Sometimes it turned sharply, sometimes it washed wide, and sometimes it snapped under throttle. Verstappen had to anticipate the car's behavior rather than react to it, a task that demanded extraordinary precision in conditions where errors were almost guaranteed. By the end of the early runs, the problem was clear. Verstappen was not fighting a normal wet weather challenge. He was fighting a car that was unable to remain inside its performance window for more than a few corners at a time. Mekies understood immediately that this was not a matter of setup or driving style. The conditions were forcing the RB21 out of its ideal band, and Verstappen was being asked to drive at the limit of a machine that no longer offered reliable feedback. This instability defined the entire qualifying narrative and set the stage for the discovery Mekies would reveal after the session. The engineering review performed by Laurent Mekies after the Las Vegas qualifying session revealed just how dangerously close the RB21 had come to falling out of its performance structure. From the moment the car returned to the garage, engineers examined the tire temperature profiles and saw a pattern that was far outside the normal range. The tires never once held the heat required to stabilize the aerodynamic floor. Instead, the rubber cooled with each sector, forcing the RB21 into a cycle where grip disappeared faster than Verstappen could generate it. Even for a top team, this kind of thermal collapse is a red flag, because it signals that the car is functioning on the very edge of its intended envelope. Mekies then turned to the aerodynamic data, and what he found confirmed his pre-session warnings. The RB21 was operating inside a window so narrow that even slight variations in temperature and water depth triggered fluctuations in downforce. The file confirms that Red Bull had already noted this vulnerability before the weekend began, and Las Vegas delivered the exact conditions that exposed it completely. The aerodynamic load curve showed abrupt rises and drops, especially in the middle of the lap, where the standing water disrupted airflow beneath the floor. Verstappen was driving a car whose aero platform was switching between stability and instability several times per corner. The floor of the RB21 is designed to generate powerful ground effect, but in the rain this system becomes exponentially more fragile. Water entering the tunnels beneath the car reduces the pressure differential that creates suction. Mekies found that during Verstappen's push laps, sections of the floor were losing efficiency in unpredictable patterns. This meant the car could suddenly lose rear stability or push into understeer depending on how the water interacted with the underbody at that moment. Verstappen's constant corrections made sense in the data. He was not driving aggressively. He was compensating for a floor that was supplying inconsistent downforce. Another engineering challenge came from how the RB21 reacted to the long straights of the Las Vegas circuit. On dry asphalt, these straights stabilized tire temperature before corner entry, but in the cold rain they became the exact opposite. The tires lost several degrees of heat before Verstappen reached the braking zone, meaning he entered corners with less grip than he had on the previous lap. Mekies identified that the tire drop on the straights contributed heavily to the aero instability. When the tires cool, they sit differently on the surface, raising the car slightly and reducing the pressure flow beneath the floor. This small height variation was enough to weaken the car's downforce generation.